Hello, everyone, and welcome to Transforming Food Systems, how food justice mindset plus food recovery brings system change. We're so excited to have this amazing panel. I'm going to just open it up for each of you to sort of introduce yourself, but just to frame, we're going to talk a little bit more about this topic together, and we are definitely going to just kind of get into it. Our pre-session was fire. I'm so excited for this panel. There were so many things that we were already ready to jump into. Victoria, I'm going to go ahead and hand it to you to go ahead and introduce yourself, and we'll kind of go in there on the group.
Perfect. Thank you, Victoria. That is always fun to do that, right? Victoria Zapata. I am with Food Rescue US. We are another food recovery platform, but my placement in this space has been proximal probably most of my life, reflecting on that, just how I grew up, where I grew up, and like the community involvement that I've had over my years.
I love it. Vanessa, heading over to you.
Thank you. And I'm so excited to be diving into this topic with you all. So I'm Vanessa Mukebi. I'm originally from Kenya, grew up in the Netherlands and Australia, and now in Chicago. And I bring that up because food is something that has been so integral across my lifespan, whether on a professional or personal basis or in my academic life, and looking at food as more than just sustenance, but a way in which we actualize not only our autonomy, but our identities, our uniqueness, and build into our social fabric of understanding that there is so much universality based on how we consume food. And so right now I work at ReFed, which is a national nonprofit that focuses on food loss and waste across the US by galvanizing the entire food system. So food recovery organizations such as yourselves, to policymakers, to food businesses, manufacturers, retail, and the like. And I work in communications, and because, the most powerful thing that I believe is the power of the pen and being able to rewrite narratives, but also to bring more awareness and action as a result of that. And then lastly, in my other capacity, I serve as vice chair at Inspiration Corporation, which is a local nonprofit in Chicago, where I'm based right now, that enacts dignity by not only providing meal services, but additional essential services such as housing, job training, and case management for those who are in need.
Thank you so much, Vanessa. We're so cool to have you. And Taylor, heading over to you.
Yes, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Taylor Ryan, she, her. I'm calling in from the hair salon right in Louisville, Kentucky. I'm actually from Paducah, Kentucky, so I like to make that clear for anybody from Louisville in the call. I am from Paducah, so I have some country roots, but I'm currently navigating the city of Kentucky. The work that we do is pivotal to anything else that's happening. Feeding people is essential. Like, you can't do anything without eating, just period. How we gather, how we build power. Any community conversations are had over food. Most times we're having family conversations over food. So a lot of love is shared through food, and that's one of the reasons that I'm at the table here, because we all need to eat. And so I started Change Today, Change Tomorrow. We focus on food justice, public health, and community engagement for Black families in the West End. The West End of Louisville is top five, one of the top five nationally segregated cities in the entire country. And so the West End of Louisville is completely segregated. We have a 9th Street divide is what we call it, and white people typically don't enter our neighborhood. And so a lot of work that we do is focused on picking up food surplus that folks can throw away on the east side and bring it over to the west side so we can all eat. I'd love to talk more about that and share our vision with everybody on the call. So I'm looking forward to this conversation. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Taylor. Great to have you for sure. So as I mentioned, my name is Victoria De La Rocca, and I am with Food Rescue Hero and Forward to Food Rescue. I helped launch Philly Food Rescue and am a dietitian in the area. And so I work alongside of a lot of our partners throughout, as well as being strategic partnership lead. So a lot of these relationships have been super important to understand. How do we interconnect? How do we really create something different than maybe what's existed in the past? And how do we work towards collaboration in this really challenging space in every way, because it's not only what we see on the ground, but what's happening really systematically. Victoria, I want to go over to you, because one of the things that we've talked about in the past is really framing this conversation and being able to understand maybe some of the common questions we should start with, right? And maybe what that looks like. So if you want to go ahead and dive right into that.
Of course. So I think, and a part of kind of the culture that we're trying to cultivate, kind of where I am, is starting with something really, really simple. And that's this notion of who asked you, right? In philanthropy and food recovery specifically, like, we have this superpower to decide that we just will do it. We can do it. It's not necessarily based on the community's ask of us. It's not necessarily based on data or science. So to the extent that we can literally just come into spaces, it is imperative that we have questions that allow us to do community-centered work justice and appropriately. And that is the participation, surveying where you intend to be of service, asking the questions, the who's, what are your needs, who's being served at this particular location. So getting some of those identifying details is so critical, and it's pivotal to the work, because it says to community, and before I say that, let's jump into the default position of power that I think we don't realize we become in our volunteerism, in our good intention, right? You become another authority over how food is flowing and how resources are accessible. And for a pantry or a church or an after-school program that's been in existence, that's going to become essentially your catch for the food that you find, what does that feel like? And what are those ripples? And what energy does that create when they've been there for 15, 20 years and haven't been able to catch that grocery store? And now you get to come in and decide who receives, right? And so having sensitivity, and maybe even just waiting for the invitation from community to serve, right? Like, I'm identifying that you exist, so there's acknowledgement, right? Like, this isn't really a new concept, Victoria. Food recovery, yes, has a picture and a handle now, but if we're honest, it's always been like communities have been working together as a collective to figure it out. Because to Taylor's point, sometimes folks don't come to our side of town, but we got to figure that out. So the questions are, who are you? What do you need? How can I be of service? Right? What's helpful? Knowing those details is so transformative to how we cannot be dismissive to the folks that are already in place, that may not have the investments and the financial privilege of having the shiny bits that they show to everybody else that they're doing the work. But it also says, I'm here to work in complement with you. I'm here to be of support of you, because we're not going to do this all alone. And it's not to shame us, but I'm asking folks to just have some situational awareness before you just decide that I'm counting millions of pounds and I'm going to work in a place that I've never lived. And also having sensitivity to the generations of folks who experience data digging, right? How many people have come into that neighborhood and asked them all the questions, got the funding, and left? Like, the thing didn't materialize. The lunch isn't better. Grandma isn't out of the neighborhood. I'm still in line. So even just having sensitivities around when you're coming in to ask the questions, to not overpromise, to be transparent about what our processes are and what is realistic in food recovery, so that we're not prophets of false hope either.
Super important framing, I think, to really how to even begin thinking about this slightly differently, right? That and maybe it's not so much differently, but it's really being able to see what maybe hasn't been seen in the past. And I think that's really, really key. When we think about embedding food justice mindset into daily operations, I'd love your take as far as the panel about what is an action an organization could take today to shift from simply recovering food to creating equitable access. To Victoria's point, right? What are some of not only the questions we should be thinking, but like why not only why that ultimately matters, but how do we shift from a place of sort of operationalizing last mile logistics to really thinking about equitable access and potentially some real world examples in that.
Yeah. If I may, I'd love to chime in here. I do think that embedding food justice shouldn't be seen as like the cherry on top that you do towards the end. That should be already deeply embedded within one's business model, operational model, and so forth. But something that I'm always cognizant of is being deliberate in how and where you serve communities and individuals in need, because environment matters. It's the same way when you're consuming something, you know, we're finicky about packaging. That's kind of why we have a lot of surplus food. So how are you wrapping your recovery efforts? Is it leftovers? Is it rotten cabbages? Is it discard? Is it undesirable? You know, that detracts from the experience, which we are trying to do, which food justice is trying to counter, because we are trying to elevate dignified experiences for people. And I think one of the biggest things is moving from a philosophy of beggars can't be choosers, and therefore employing a human-centered approach. So as I mentioned, like the work I do with Inspiration Corporations, one of the key, we are now working with Food for Soul. And for those who may be familiar with Chef Massimo Bottura, it's basically his nonprofit arm that's developing what we call social kitchens and community hubs. It goes beyond food. And these are called refecterios. So the Refecterio Chicago is being established hopefully soon. And a key part of that we've been working on, I'm part of the food recovery committee, is doing needs assessments. So we work with different partners, what was formerly known as Heartland Alliance, to do those assessments of like beyond just meal, provision and recovery of surplus food. What else do people need? And looking at it holistically, because when we look at why people are in need of food, the majority of that comes from equity, like systematic inequities. And so we're looking at the root causes of it, but also looking at solutions that marry those root causes with solutions. So that is housing, that is providing essential services such as job training and skills development. And so we're not creating this like vicious cycle of dependency, but allowing people to be able to empower themselves and have autonomy to do things. And even amongst that, it's small things as little as that I didn't even know was like transport. I don't know if you're familiar with Chicago, but it's one of the most socially segregated cities. And a lot of these, like whether it's pantries, whether it's food distribution centers, they're so far away from the city, where majority of people, we particularly focus on the populations that have or experiencing houselessness. And so if someone is required to go 10 miles to receive food, how are you expecting them to do so? So everything from transportation to even podiatry services, looking again at the holistic aspects of things. Then again, if somebody is requiring food, if we're giving them fresh food, which is all in the good name of things, but if they're not even able to cook so because they don't even have a permanent housing, that's the other aspect. So it's looking at ways in which, there are people out there who are doing the work and you can't do it alone, and understanding that, first of all, yes, the food justice sort of model has to be embedded into it, and knowing that it's a continuous cycle, but it's not something that we just do as an afterthought.
Yeah, I think that's what makes it so important to have people who are impacted making decisions for people who are impacted and with people who are impacted. I think that's what makes the work that I'm doing with Change Today, Change Tomorrow so unique and so special. We may not be serving thousands and thousands of people, but the 200 families that we do serve each week, we are meeting with them. They know us. We know their names. We know their faces. We are a dual organization for a reason. So we're not just bringing food to people. We're giving people recipes. We're doing food demonstrations. Thursday at our grocery giveaway. Also, our grocery giveaways are in neighborhoods. So we don't just have one location. We're in 4 different neighborhoods. We're eliminating that transportation barrier. Transportation access in my neighborhood is 30%. And so we only have one grocery store for 60,000 people to split. And so it's really hard for people to do that in one grocery store. And so we're holding summits. We're having community feedback meetings. We have working groups. We have parent and caregiver support groups. we are really providing that wraparound where we're not trying to solve a problem for everyone, but we really see ourselves as opportunity facilitators. And if you have a skill or a need, we can connect you to whatever that looks like next. And so everybody is living their own individual lives and they have their own individual needs. And so we're not providing a cookie cutter, one size fits all experience. We recently had an experience in our giveaway where, you know, we had one of our family members who was upset about the quality, well, not the quality, but the quantity of what we had to provide. But our quantity is based on what we receive. And we had to get her to understand that in that moment that, yes, this is frustrating, but also if you call these white people on us, then you're stopping food for everybody here. So how can we give you a little extra so we can, you know, move this along and calm this down? But that's that extra piece of intentional care of like, what do you need? Instead of just writing people off and excommunicating people and never serving that person again. We'll put people to the side and have intentional conversations about what's going on. She's frustrated about having access to 2 potatoes, but really her lights are off. You know, those are other things that people are not communicating and people simply not asking those questions. And when it comes to questions, data extraction is really, you know, invasive. And so one thing we do with data at Change Today, Change Tomorrow is we're asking people 1 question per week versus asking people 52 questions. So that by the end of the year, we do have 52 questions answered in a way less invasive, way less traumatic experience. As you sign in to get your groceries, you answer 1 question. You know you're coming back next week. And at the end of the year, we have a comprehensive report that we did not have to sit you down for 3 hours to extract all this information and make you and re-traumatize you. So I think it's really important to have people who are impacted making these decisions with people who are impacted. I live in the neighborhood I serve. I'm a single mom, and that's what really keeps us going. We have Black board members and Black staff, and we're really intentional about how we serve.
Thank you both, Vanessa and Taylor. I love how both of you really shared very practical ways of doing that in different communities that are incredibly local to your community and really respect voices that unfortunately I think have been often silenced in this space. And to your point, Taylor, being able to understand what an individual needs and also what programmatic opportunities we might have to meet those. And sometimes there's limitations, right? I mean, that's just the reality of oftentimes what that looks like in this space, especially in food recovery, how food is often very irregular. We know that like there's just going to be different things on different days, right? And that inherently it can be confusing for communities for sure. You know, one of the things that we were talking about really on the ground in these sort of operational pieces, but with food recovery, we know that it is really connecting to the community and those individual needs, while it's also thinking about systematic change. And Vanessa, I think that was a really great point about thinking about it's not the cherry on top, right? They're not actually separate. However, when we think about how organizations can sort of strike a balance in between sort of what they're doing every single day and what that looks like to think about long-term equity. What are your thoughts? And really, you know that many of the organizations and those that are on this at this conference are feeling that stress of limited resources, right? And sort of thinking about, all right, which of these do I do, or do I do them both, or what does this look like? And how can we maybe do that a little better?
Yeah, you did. I really also want to touch on Taylor's point because lived experience, people with lived experience and continuous are such underutilized resource in all of this, and having that is so crucial. But as you talk about this, what I'm reminded of, like in our position as ReFed, you know, we are not boots on the ground. We look at things holistically, and our goal really is being able to collaborate and convene every single sector together to be able to see this. And I think one of the biggest issues is, but just before I say that, is understanding that we can do it both at the same time. It's not like, oh my gosh, you have to have the most perfect food justice model. Like your ongoing food recovery efforts can be in parallel to building in a food justice model. But where we look at our role in creating more of that systemic change, and systems meaning not this complex, convoluted thing, but systems being about people and different actors, is, providing resources such as funding, providing resources such as coalitions like the Zero Food Waste Coalition, where, we're helping to inform policy through our data. Now, as a 501c3, we cannot actively advocate, but what we can do is provide that data provision. And where we see in general, food recovery is like our we ultimately want to prevent waste from happening food from going to waste in the first place. But we know that that is inevitable to certain degrees, but what can we do next? And so what we are trying to do is catalyze more funding into this space where we do see, different entities or organizations that are able to carry on the work of ensuring that food is rescued and recovered, and food that is both nutritious, that is sustainable, that is culturally acceptable. There are people, we can't do it alone. And that's a really big part in this, is knowing that it's not for one single organization to feel as though you have to solve all the world's problems on your own. It just doesn't happen. Partnerships are key, no matter how hard that is. And that's really also what the bread and the butter of our summit is all about, because we know that, for instance, capital providers such as funders may not necessarily have that education. That's our role to play. We facilitate that education, but we can't do that alone and in a vacuum if we don't hear it from food recovery organizations on what actually is happening on the ground, so that we can further educate upwards. And I think that a continuous cycle of us, implementing not only actions within our own fields, but allowing for that knowledge transfer to happen. And that in itself informs how funding cycles do happen, because then we have those connections and are able to say, look, it seems as though we need to rethink models of how we're measuring success when it comes to food recovery. It's not so much about pounds, an X amount of pounds saved, but how many communities and how many lives are transformed. You can say you've recovered 60,000 pounds. I wouldn't even remember that number. But if you tell me that, you've deeply embedded maybe an access for like school children to be nourished on during their summer break, like that speaks volumes. And so how we also transform, again, back to being a storyteller, those narratives of how we measure success informs how other stakeholders within the food system, within the food waste sector, are able to see and support food recovery efforts.
If I can jump in, because I also want to give the perspective of the food recovery organizations who may not be the hand passing the food to the particular community member, but to give a perspective on how you all can feel empowered and feel like there are some steps that we can take, because I sit in that segmentation. First, just acknowledging the thing in the room. Getting food to people is incredibly labor intensive, and it takes a lot of hands and a lot of people and several systems to do that. And I think as the collective, being transparent and being more open about just how many groups and organizations it takes to maybe get an apple from an orchard to the community will help also break down this misconception about what is free food and how food moves in this country. Because I think it's we talk about the and all the time, Victoria. It is an and. So just giving people a better understanding of how much energy goes into moving food from space to space. But for those of us who are maybe representatives or extensions of community by way of where we're positioned in this food redirection, our empowerment is elevating their voices. It is the stakeholders shifting, not necessarily from the young lady who's receiving the food on that Wednesday distribution, but maybe the pantry organizers, and like, what is their experiences? What are some of the stop starts that happen from them? And since we are becoming conduits in how food is being pivoted or rechanneled in community, having a way of communicating, like the mapping in the food ecosystem, as some like to call it, because the other reality of our space is everybody's vested interest is very different. And we play around, or I play around with this notion of food recovery from a commodity standpoint, right? Because our food system is industrialized. And so who you're centralizing in your experience will dictate kind of how your operations flow. So if it's about catching tons of volume, Do you have enough understanding about your backyard that you can quickly pivot? I'm not saying you have to choose. I don't have an opinion one way or another, but the better you understand how food is moving in your backyard, because you have already had those inclusive conversations, then we can be appropriate in placement, we can be efficient in placement, and we can bring the volume where volume can be accepted, so it doesn't overwhelm and it doesn't dismiss people's experience and capacity. For those of us who aren't necessarily passing food in hand to the people in community, creating the space, as Vanessa and Taylor have touched upon, to elevate, and maybe they're a part of ideation before there's deployment, right? Like having a reserved and an intentional space to say that we have continuous feedback on what we're doing, and catch the word continuous, put the emphasis there, like food justice and participation. There's no place that you arrive to, right? There is a continual conversation, right? And there's a continual checking in of the pulse and the heartbeat of the places in which you're trying to be of service. And so for that systemic change, it's being transparent and sharing those stories, because there are folks already doing the policy work. To your point, I'm a big fan of Zero Food Waste Coalition, the way that they're able to organize and make policy feel less intimidating, right? Because if that's not your forte, you kind of sometimes can't see how what you're saying matters. I'm going to tell you why it matters, because your policymaker isn't in your neighborhood. And so when people are ideating from a desk about how food should be reaching your community, you can provide those simple stories in your essence, in your experience, and that is very impactful, believe it or not, because it may not hit like they think they're hitting, right? It's not optimized, it's not efficient, but you being able to recall that, reflect that, document that is the way that we shape policy, right? We are the fibers. Food recovery is the fiber. There's a broad stroking like mechanism around hunger relief in this country, but oftentimes it doesn't have the details. So for those of us who are in the neighborhood, touching hands, having listening sessions, that's something that we are developing on our site, where some of our leadership is going in and sitting with the receiving agencies and just listening. Like, what can we do differently? How can we be more efficient? And it's not challenging people to be anything more or less than what they are or have the capacity to do. And then I think the only other thing, and I'm going to be quiet because there's other people want to talk, is to also understand that food justice doesn't have to be loud, right? It doesn't have to be the tambourine in the chorus. It could just have that intentionality that you're carrying with you, right? Because again, everybody's interest in this space varies, and you can be thoughtful and you can be mindful about how you're moving on behalf of your community, and maybe your donor, that's not their thing. You don't have to wave that banner at that transaction, but you hold the knowledge and you have the intentionality, and the impact for the folks you want to be of service to is the same, right? So just even having that awareness, it's not something you necessarily have to champion outward. It is an internal conversation. It is something that you create the culture for in your organizations, and it's not, I don't think it's as scary when we just acknowledge that it's not a us and them, and that people who are experiencing food insecurity is just that, it's their experience, and it is not their identity, and it's less of the us and them, because if we're not careful, we'll continue to perpetuate that.
Whew, I'm telling you, it's almost hard to jump in, because I feel like, okay, we'll just keep rolling with it, because I just feel like there's incredible points that everybody is bringing up. One of the things that I hear often from a food recovery space, and it's what you were speaking of a little earlier, Victoria, is that oftentimes it's just really challenging, gritty work, and it's really, really scarce, right? It's very difficult. You have a lot to do, and it's challenging. However, one of the things that I think is core to what many of us believe is that we really need to go beyond connecting and honoring the cultural values of our communities, and really partnering, and not, as you said a second ago, not connecting as if we are providers and recipients. And that really is a very difficult dynamic to continue to sort of challenge and also think about what that looks like. And Taylor, I loved one of the things you brought up is like extracting data is just that, right? And the idea of asking one question that's more of a conversation, that's part of an integration into having a voice be heard versus meeting programmatic needs is a really great piece of that. But I'd love to hear everyone's thoughts about how we could really start putting into practice some of that authentic collaboration that acknowledges the space is of course difficult, but the voices are really crucial. And we've been hearing a lot of that, but I'd love to drill down even more into that space.
I'm really always focused on disrupting spaces. So any table I'm at, I'm always trying to open the door for other people. And so sometimes that's, well received and sometimes it's not, but at all times we are heard because I'm gonna speak up. I think, Patrick, can you pull up slide 9 real quick? Slide 9 is talking about like how we're building people power specifically. And so we have to have several different entry points as a dual organization. We're not just feeding people who come here. Yes, they're getting free groceries, but they may also be a part of our community advisory council, who's shaping our agendas for our community feedback meeting, which is shaping the vision for the land that we own, which also shapes the vision for our farmers market. We have the only farmers market in the West End currently. We have a parenting caregiver support group, which you may not receive groceries from us, but you may be in that group, which also receives winter holiday outreach support called Bless the Block. All of these integral points also build fellowship and trust and community outside of eating. We're also building power. So at these meetings, we're talking about who's on the ballot, what's going on. We're doing harm reduction trainings within our spaces. And so you may come here for groceries, but you may leave with an announcement that they're paying, light bills down the street. You may come here for your fresh RX of an expecting mother, for your, $26 bag of fresh produce, but you may leave with your Trader Joe's groceries as well. And as you're out the door, we're telling you about an event that's coming up that has nothing to do with us, but you may be interested in it because they're giving out other resources that we're not hitting. But we're also telling you about the Metro Council meeting. We're also telling you, like last week we sent out a letter that was just focused on Metro Council meetings. What is it? How to get on the agenda? Why is it important to attend even if you're not talking? How to access it virtually? Like, we're really big on information dissemination because that's something that we know as Black people, Black poor people, information is up here and it just sometimes just doesn't come down to us. It doesn't trickle down. And so there are things happening, there are decisions being made, and people are not calling us. People are not knocking on our doors and asking us, do we want to go to this? And so that's our intentional piece of how can we connect some dots, and not connect all the dots, but be intentional about what we can do. And if we're having a working group meeting that was birthed from our summit, these working groups are working on 4 food justice projects that have nothing to do with Change Today, Change Tomorrow. They are simply 4 different working groups who came together and said, these are the goals that we want to have for the next 6 months. And that's how you build power. People who attended our summit were not food justice professionals. They were consumers. They were DoorDash drivers. They were chefs. They were cooks. They were caterers. These are all people. They were farmers. They were urban growers. And all these people come together in our foodscape, and now they're making decisions. And even if you are just an eater, that's a large part of the foodscape, eaters. And so now we're all coming together to face challenges, and we've recently established the Greater River Food Council alongside Food in Neighborhoods. And so we're really looking to be able to establish some policy around food waste elimination, around food access, and really just build power in the Black community. Thank you, Patrick.
Thank you, Taylor. I'd love Victoria and Vanessa's thoughts as well about thinking about that multiple entry point piece that Taylor brought up. I think that's a really great way of sort of conceptualizing how to maybe look at what that might be in various regions and what that could kind of look like a little bit more.
Okay, so from where we're kind of positioned in this space, I'm going to circle back to when you have an understanding. I think the other part of understanding how food is flowing, who is doing what's the leadership, is also realizing that sometimes we're not the messenger, and who is saying and who is the face matters, and it will affect how you connect with community. So sometimes we just have to humble ourselves as food recovery organizations and not be so worried about who's doing the interview for local news, but maybe we've invited the actual group or organization or the folks that community is already entrusted to do the facilitation, and then we just become a vessel. And you have to be okay with when to step aside, I think, is also transformative. And knowing that being an ally can be just as powerful and helpful than being the center stage. So I would offer that.
I'd like to substantiate what Victoria said, because I do think that from like our viewpoint, there's a bit of an unfair responsibility that is being placed on food recovery organizations to do it all. Like, food justice is not at that point, when somebody is desperately in need of food, doesn't have any other aspects of, attaining it. Like, that's not the position to be now worrying and saying, oh gosh, how are we fighting racism? How are we fighting, zoning issues or food apartheid or whatever that is, and it's difficult, but at the same time, that responsibility has been placed. I mean, there is like an active desire to do so, and I really, really commend organizations such as all of you doing so, because it is a bit of an unfair burden. So I really wanted to point that out, and I know Victoria Z, you have lots of thoughts on that, as far as like, at what point do we realize that it's not quote unquote our lane to be, to be the forebearers of certain things. But I do think, as far as how I see it, is understanding that we can design with and not for. I think where we have typically seen really good examples of this, and Victoria D, you might recall this, when we were in Minneapolis, and our first summit after the COVID, after the pandemic, and after the racial reckoning was in Minneapolis, and that was very strategically placed there, but for so many other reasons, because of its vast food systems. But I recall us going on a field trip to Minnesota Central Kitchens. And I believe that their model was just so awe-inspiring, because not only have they created a way for, like, this, worked with different entities such as like international markets, but they're also working with the sous chef, Sean Sherman, to be able to reinvigorate indigenous food systems. So knowing who your populations are, Minnesota has a very high population of Somali immigrants and other immigrant groups. And it's like, okay, how can we tailor our efforts? And knowing that, depending on what happens, the COVID was such a huge sort of transformational change to the way we operate. There could be other upsets. Chicago's seen a high proportion of migrants. So our Inspiration Corporate, we've now, changed our model to serve more foods that would, account for these new populations. So understanding that, we can be agile in how we address these issues, but knowing that it's not, again, it's like, if we ourselves don't have the infrastructure, we can quote unquote white label by, partnering with organizations, with partnering with those subject matter experts who do have that. And so by working with like the Natives Kitchen, Minnesota Central Kitchen has been able to reach a very hard, Native and indigenous groups of people who do suffer at disproportionate rates of food scarcity and so forth. And I do think that that's really a good sort of model. And I do think, just on a practical level, it's also understanding, like, who your organization is being led by. Look at your boards, look at your advisory councils. Is there ways in which we can have more people who are either deeply impacted, have lived experiences in such issues, who do represent a more diverse viewpoint, whether not so much even in positionality, but as far as who they've worked with in the past. And I think that can help inform how we think and articulate about organizations' unique efforts to recover more food and ensure it doesn't go to landfill.
That's a great point. And thank you all for all of your active participation in the chat and kind of jumping in. I see a lot of cheering going on as everyone is resonating with what so many of the panelists are saying. A couple of questions that, one of the questions that came in is really thinking about a system change to eliminate the need entirely for a charitable food system. So it's just thinking like airplane level, what are some changes and what that needs to look like? And then ultimately, what role would food recovery play, or does it at that point no longer exist? Now, Victoria, I know you and I have very strong opinions about the fact, like, please put us all out of a job. Like, we would love to see it. Like, please do. And I think that it would be amazing, right? But just thinking about sort of big picture, what are some of your thoughts on that?
Anyone want to go first? I'm gonna not unravel. I'm not gonna unravel here. So I'm gonna say just from the jump, is this really unintentional? And I think if you can be honest about how we get here, then we can be honest about realistic expectations we can do to mitigate, right? I don't think that the way that the food is flowing and how people are hungry and how it's still a broken thing is unintentional. It is a very profitable space. And some folks are rewarded by taking their waste and donating it or whatever it is they're doing with it. But nonetheless, I think I think that given where we are, and we talk about this at the junction in which food recovery is interceding, we are at an emergent situation. People are at the last end of their rope, right? The food is already going to be discarded more than likely. And so I'm going to share more of a liberatory energy that I feel to share in this space. I think at this crossroad, we have the ability to shift narratives on a number of planes. At the rate that recovered food has not been grown with the intention or is not already designated for a particular person or body. So to that extent, when we think about philanthropy and food support and like the history in this country, which some of us, I think, forget not that long ago, like food has been used as a weapon, as a political tool. It has been used to control people in this country. And so because the unrecovered food isn't designated for a particular person, right, that is liberating. So we have to be conscious not to recreate these constraints and this policing of food, and because you don't have to necessarily be income dependent to receive recovered food, where you don't have to prove you're poor, right? We shift the narrative, right? It's about who needs support without shame, without relegating them or making them identify as a particular something. And I think that gives us room to breathe, right? It can destigmatize the experience to an extent that you don't have to write your troubles down to access this per se, right? Pending where you're delivering that food to. I think another liberating piece about food recovery and justice is the way that we can kind of open up ableism, right? Like when we think about community, sometimes we forget about the folks who can't do anything with a box of fresh produce. Maybe we're talking about the adults who are living in assisted living and they're not neurotypical. What are their abilities? What are the abilities of our aging? What are the abilities of our veterans? What are the abilities of anyone's something that's other than all of us who have all of the functions and faculties of our body, our mind, and our spirit. But because we can take a pause and we don't necessarily have the urgency of bureaucracy behind some of what we're doing, we can also remember the forgotten folks in community and what they're doing. But as far as like making it go away, yeah, please do put me out of a job. But I think so long as there's food, there will always be access. Right. And until we kind of go to the Hill and challenge industry about why they're overproducing at such a rate, and no one's going out of business, keep that in mind, that they're overproducing at such a rate, the onus is not on us to mitigate that. That's somebody else's question to answer, is my belief. I think we do what we can and we try to optimize, making sure that it's not completely wasted, but I don't think that's our lane per se.
point. And gosh, this could go on so long. I have so many areas that I want to just keep going with, and we're coming up on our last 5 minutes. There's some really great questions in the chat about collaborating with local governments and really thinking about capacity building. So I'd love each of you just to kind of give your sort of last round of thoughts in this topic. I know that's such a hard thing to do, but I definitely want to make sure you each get a chance to just kind of share sort of parting thoughts about what you feel like is going to be really important for organizations to understand that may be listening in.
I'm going to give my little 2 cents and give the floor to Victoria and Taylor, who are masterminds here. But and this will also answer, I think, Amanda's question about other organizations. Food Shift is one of an example that comes to mind. They were one of our grantees, and I think one of during our inaugural catalytic grant fund, and it's really about how we look towards food as not just, again, like it's not just this lifeless commodity. It is one of the most intimate investments we make on a daily basis. It can either allow people to thrive, it can allow people to just merely survive, or it could deprive from people by, having counter effects on them. And so how we sort of formulate that in our services, I think a lot of organizations who are, working in the food recovery space, and Victoria Z will speak more on this, is by the time someone is actually requiring food assistance, there's so much more that's going on. And knowing that you're not just merely passing off pounds of sort of like, I use the example of a hot potato. There's a surplus food that goes from farm to the manufacturer, and everyone's like, it's not my responsibility to discard it. And we're just quote unquote going to use humans as those in need as human receptacles or human landfills, and understanding that, okay, if we are at that point, knowing that if somebody is in need, like or if communities are in need, how do we further create less harm and less trauma and less violence in that act of providing assistance, and being mindful of that, and knowing that I don't know, at this point, there's still so much to be done, but I do think that dignified service, embedding a form of dignity within everyone's services is really crucial to solving some of these issues.
Yeah, I kind of want to speak a little bit on the charity piece. We started out as a very small organization, very mutual aid grassroots approach. And then our local police department murdered Breonna Taylor, and our entire city shifted as a whole. And Feed the West, our free grocery program, was not actually birthed from food recovery. It was birthed from white guilt. White women in particular were going in masses to the grocery stores and purchasing just thousands of dollars in groceries and bringing it over to the West End. And we were doing a free grocery program. And then when COVID ended, people went back to work, and we were feeding hundreds of people, and we had to figure out how to do that with no money because, again, we were a small mutual aid organization. And we developed a relationship with one grocery store, Trader Joe's, and we are, I would say, combating what, typical food systems and food banking organizations are doing. We are the conduit, but we are not the gatekeeper. And we're also providing a very cyclical approach to what we're doing. And so we're not shoving food in people's faces and say, hey, you need this, eat this. This is definitely a grocery shopping experience. You grab a bag. You're not told to give us any information. I don't need to see an ID. I don't need to know that you have SNAP. I don't care what you do with the groceries. If you go home and make plates and sell them. We also give out flowers at the end of our serve. And so if you take flowers and sell them or make bouquets, please do what you need to do. But know that in this space, you are safe, and this is not a charity. One thing that we're focused on next year is how do we dismantle our line, because it still brings shame and guilt. But even though we're providing this wonderful experience because we're all Black, there's still a line. There's still a power dynamic. And how can we dismantle that with the people that we're serving? Because we are the people that we're serving. Nobody on my staff buys groceries. We also eat the groceries that we're serving. And so one thing we're working on as a small organization to combat that charity mindset is how Are we working with the people that we're serving? How are we the people that we serve?
Yeah. Sorry, Taylor, you just reminded me of one minor thought, because I mean, everything there was perfect, but you hit on the fact that how I think a huge part of this is also how we change discourse as well. Because, you know, we typically talk about food waste, you know, we want to end food waste or we want to go out of business. But again, like how like change today, change tomorrow's, it's like repackaging that. There's so much like prestige, and you know, food is not just a right, but it's being created in a way where people can actually feel like, okay, I'm not just a charity case for this. And I think that that's so crucial, and that's even, you know, what Food Shift does, what Inspiration Corporation does. It's like it's restaurant level food that is being repackaged, and so it's not just a box of moldy food. You know, you are actively seeing people as humans and wanting to nourish them. And I think that is so crucial, and like understanding that we're not just doing the work that we do to put food on our tables for our own selves, but we're actually caring about the people that we're serving.
Can I jump in just real quick? We have a local organization that does that as well. It's called Feed Louisville, and we actually trade food back and forth. And any food that we don't provide that is edible, we actually give to farmers for their livestock or compost in our gardens. So I just wanted to add that in there, that we are also working on our food waste elimination as an organization.
That's great. Oh my goodness. I hate that we're coming to the end of this. Victoria, I want to hear your parting thoughts before we have to sign off.
I'll do it really, really quickly. So I'll say elevate the dignity of choice. So not only should you be providing choices at the end recipient side, but as food recovery organizations, empower yourselves to also implement those qualitative things, right? Like we're not recycling organizations. Like we are here on behalf of community. So don't accept the Gaylord of half rotten, you know, watermelons, because they've already gotten their receipt, but we don't really have to bring that into our spaces. So just being mindful about that. And then also cross-directionally, making sure that you're taking a moment to explain to maybe like that restaurant, hey, or that supermarket, if you can just call us a day earlier, and kind of give them like the differential experience community has when we have an extra day. So being willing to capture and pass information to elevate everybody, from your volunteers who we don't want schlepping through rotten food. That's not dignified, even when they're standing on behalf of community. And then ultimately not letting old food continue through a cycle that it need not, because we have the capacity, or we are able to say, no, this isn't up to par, even for food recovery. Like, this isn't it. So I encourage you all to kind of keep some standards and raise the baseline, because it raises the experience for everybody down the line.
Thank you. Thank you all so much. This is incredible. And thank you all, audience, for all of your insight and also all your compliments. Panelists, take a look. There's their fan. You've got a fan group here. I do want to just say, in addition, we have a really exciting panel coming up on upcycling, which is really amazing. And they are going to talk about a lot of the dignity in food and how can we preserve that along the way, which is incredibly exciting as well. So thank you all, and we look forward to the next panel.
Thank you all.